wrong book, Becky. Okay. Well, Jesus, we're just grateful to come back together and be with one another and talk to one another. And Lord, we're looking forward to once again just learning from who you are and from your Spirit, from your Word, Lord. And so we just ask that you would teach us a little bit more about your heart, a little bit more about your mind, a little bit more about your desires tonight, Lord. In your name, amen. Amen. Okay. I gotta get my glasses on. There we go. All right, so we left off 1 Samuel 21. I think that we stopped at verse 7, essentially. Yeah, no, essentially verse 6. Okay, so if you remember, what we went over in 1 Samuel 20 was Saul's calculated plan using one of those feasts, right, the new moon festival, to essentially capture and kill David. And Jonathan and him set up this elaborate plan for Jonathan to communicate whether Saul had actually has that intent. And he did, as we saw last week. And so then at the end of that chapter, David takes off and becomes essentially a refugee and will be a refugee for really the remainder of his time until Saul is dead. So it's about 15 years when we look at when David first comes onto the scene and Saul finally dies. Okay, so not all of that David was a refugee during, but much of it. So we're not a long time where he was really not comfortable in the nation of Israel because his life was being pursued by Saul. Right, so then if you remember, he flees and he went to then Nob, okay, the city Nob, and Ahimelech was the priest there. This is where the tabernacle was, and David requested for some of the showbread, or the bread of the face, if you remember what we talked about last time. And Ahimelech agreed to that, even though it wasn't really technically lawful for David to eat of that bread. It was really meant for the priests to do that. And that's where we left off. So today, what we'll look at in chapter 21, and we'll complete chapter 22 as well, some historical stuff, more historical details about David's life and Saul's pursuit of him and those surrounding him. Kind of the madness of Saul, really. We'll see that on full display. But one of the interesting things that we get in this, these two chapters in particular, is that there is particular psalms that David wrote during these times. And we know that they're during these times because he actually, at the very top of the psalm, said these are the things that were happening in his life, essentially. So so the Psalms are particularly ascribed to these events. So not only do we get to see the historical details, but we get to see David's thoughts during this time. So we'll read actually several of those Psalms and just hopefully learn something from David in terms of his thought life and his heart towards the Lord in these times of trouble. I mean, you really have to kind of try and put yourself into the shoes of David. He is literally running for his life. Saul has essentially the power of his entire army and the entire nation, if you really will, that can pursue him. Right, so he's in a very dangerous situation. True, he's not trying to evade the CIA and all the technology that we have today, but nonetheless, still very dangerous. Okay, so you have to kind of put yourself in David's shoes to understand his heart, and we'll try and see that in these Psalms. Now, before we do that, I want to though spend just a little bit more time on this bread of the face, or the showbread, because Jesus brings this out in a discussion that he has with the Pharisees in Matthew 12. So go ahead and we'll start today reading Matthew 12, the first 8 verses of that chapter. And it's an interesting little thing. And I think last week we didn't really have time to go through this, but I think is a really nice addition to this little chapter that we in this little set of verses that we've been reading through. And if you remember last week, I made mention of the fact that Saul is illustrating this attitude towards these rituals, the new moon festivals. His attitude's not in it, and his heart is not right in it. Right, he is just a religious duty, but he's doing it to kind of check the boxes. His heart is not pursuing the Lord in this, okay, and in those things. And I read Isaiah 1, actually, if you remember last week, where the Lord says to the nation of Israel, says, I hate these festivals. I hate this religious observances that you're doing, even though he told them to do it, because they were guilty. He said that their hands were full of blood, and they were coming to him thinking that they just had to check their boxes and maintain a happy deity so that they can get what they wanted, essentially. Okay, so we see that actually here. So let's read Matthew 12. We see this here in this discussion that Jesus has with these Pharisees. Okay, so it says in verse 1 of chapter 12 of Matthew, at that time Jesus went on the Sabbath through the grain fields, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, behold, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Now, understand that was their understanding of what was not lawful for them to do on the Sabbath. They considered what the disciples were doing as work. They considered it as harvesting. Okay, so if you look in the law said that it prohibited harvesting on the Sabbath. Well, picking the heads of grain and rubbing it on their hands and then eating it was harvesting to the Pharisees. So they, were extraordinarily legalistic about these things, and that's what they were confronting Jesus on. Really, the heart that they have in this is to trap Jesus, right? They want to get him, they don't like him, okay? But he said to them, now remember, the Pharisees, if you keep this in mind, Pharisees are religious leaders and rulers of the New Testament period, or really the first century, the time of Jesus. Okay, so they would have been looked up to as the most religious and holy and pure men. Okay, right. So, but Jesus said to them, have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone, which is exactly what we read about last week and discussed last week. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. Now here's a verse I want to highlight. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion or mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Okay, we'll stop right there. And so Jesus is trying to make this point that he's pointing these religious leaders, these Pharisees, to the central component of the law. Okay, and he quotes actually in verse 7 Hosea 6:6. Okay. And it really points to God's heart, that God is a God of mercy, that he's a God of grace, and that he's a God of love. And that the things of the law were to point men and mankind to that very fact. Okay, one aspect of the law was to illustrate that we are sinners. Okay, in fact, Paul recognized that the purpose and the function of the law was to show the human being that we are indeed incapable of maintaining what would be considered the standard of holiness that God puts before us. Okay, that's one of the functions of the law. That then should lead someone to God to then say, God, forgive me of my sins, and they then would then come to a knowledge of the forgiveness of their sins, his mercy, his grace, and his love. Okay. The Pharisees, however, viewed the law as you have to keep it. To be holy, you have to keep the law. Okay, so what they were doing is they were trying to use the law as the solution to man's problem, that they were sinners. Okay, and this would be kind of like a doctor taking your temperature and finding out that you have, right, with a thermometer, finding out that you have a fever, and then saying, now swallow the thermometer, right? The thermometer simply records the temperature of the human being, right? It's not the solution to the problem. That's the law. The law records the problem with the human being, but it's not the solution. Okay, it can't be kept, it can't be maintained. The solution is found in the forgiveness that we find in the blood of Jesus Christ. Right? So Jesus points these Pharisees using David, okay, using this example, he points them, he says, you know this story about David that wasn't necessarily holy of him, right? That wasn't right of him. And so you guys are missing the whole point of all of this. The whole point of this is that you need to understand compassion. You need to understand mercy. You need to understand grace. That's what the law is pointing the human being to. Okay, but they had made, okay, mankind does this. They had made the law the everything. Okay, and when you think about mankind, we want to control things. I don't, but Becky does. Okay, if you know anything about me,
he's a management specialist.
I'm a management specialist, and a management enthusiast. Is what I am. But we want to control things, and you look at really paganism, okay. You see that the pagan essentially is doing things to keep a deity happy and controlling the deity. I do this, the deity does this, right? You think about we worship the sun or the god of the sun, so that then the sun will be kind to us and will help us grow crops. We worship, right, the god of the rain and thunder, right, so that then the rains will come at the appropriate time, and we give them sacrifice. It's all this manipulation to try and get what we want, and that's not at all the true and living God. He's not to be manipulated. He is a God that has sought human beings out, has taken the most extraordinary measures that he could to be in relationship with us, and we are to respond to him in his initiation of that relationship through his son Jesus Christ and the sacrifice he made on the cross and his resurrection. Okay, so I thought that this was, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to bring Matthew into this, okay, and Jesus' understanding of the law and his discussion with the Pharisees after we had read, of course, what David had done. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead now and move on past now. David gets the bread from Ahimelech, the priest, okay, and he is going to, as you see here in a little bit, is going to go on his way, okay. But now here's a very important part of this as we head into chapter 22. It says, now, this is verse 7 I'm in, 1 Samuel 21 now. It says, now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. Okay, so Doeg is going to be a really important character, okay, as we move forward in this next chapter. But it says he was detained before the Lord. Why? What does that mean? It can mean several things. It says he's an Edomite. Edomites were not Israelites, okay, so are from Edom, but Doeg has actually got a really high position in Saul's court, if you will. He's this chief shepherd, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but that was like the minister of finance, right? I mean, it was a really important position, okay? And David definitely recognizes who he is. But it says that he's detained before the Lord. There are three theories in terms of what he was being detained for. One, he was trying to convert to Judaism, okay, and there was then rituals that he would have to perform as an Edomite, including being circumcised as an adult. Not fun. But that could be it. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. The Scripture doesn't tell us. Two, he had already done that and was doing what's called the Nazirite vow. Okay, this is something that was described in the law. They'd shave their head and they'd do all these ritualistic things, and they'd have to be around the temple for a certain amount of time, or the tabernacle for a certain amount of time. Or he had committed some sin and was then he was then trying to make amends for that sin. Okay, Alex is trying to get in, so I'm gonna let him in here real quick. Hey, Alex, how's it going?
They're okay. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. We're on verse 7 of chapter 21. So, okay, so
Cool.
so anyway, so Doeg, he's there. That's the important part. We don't know why exactly he's there. It says he's detained before the Lord, but he's there. Okay, and certainly David recognizes him as being part of Saul's courts, and a very important part of Saul's courts. Okay, and so David said to Ahimelech, "Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matters was urgent." Then the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it. For there is no other except it here." And David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Okay. So apparently at some point in time, David, after he killed Goliath, essentially gave that sword that he had used to cut the head of Goliath off to the priest. I'm not entirely sure why. No one really is entirely sure why that transaction occurred. It's possible, though, that David recognized the sheer abnormality of what had happened. Okay, that he was able to defeat Goliath, and the sword then is essentially a memento of God's provision for the nation of Israel. So in the tabernacle there was other mementos of God's provision for the nation of Israel. One of which was Moses' staff, which of course split the Red Sea and performed lots of other miraculous things, or that God used to perform other miraculous things. So the sword might be there to kind of go along with this. But David's going to take it back. Like, okay, I'll just use it. I'll bring it back. Okay. So verse 10, then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Okay, but the servant of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, Gath, okay, just to remember, okay, or just to remind you, Gath is Philistine territory. Gath was where Goliath was from. So in waltzes David into essentially Gath with Goliath's sword strapped to his waist, okay? And they all look at him and say, "Oh, that's David. Yeah, remember he killed Goliath." This is a dangerous situation for David. Not entirely sure why he would go there. Doesn't really tell us. But at this point in time, it would seem that he is essentially captured, okay, by these Philistines and is taken before this king of Gath. And they're saying, this is David, right? And this is what they would used to sing about David, and still do sing about David. Saul slaying his thousands and David his 10,000. That's us. That was us that they were talking about and singing about, okay? Now, David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity. So this is what David does. Disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gates and let his saliva run down into his beard. Right? In other words, David recognizes this is bad. Right? They recognize me as their like arch enemy. And so maybe if I just kind of go insane or act like I'm insane, that will either convince them that, I'm not worth their troubles, or convince them that I'm certainly not the individual that could have killed Goliath. Okay. And so he feigns madness, essentially. Okay. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? shall this one come into my house? In other words, the king says, this is not David, right? You captured this individual. This is not David because he's nuts. You see him, he's nuts. Okay. And at that point in time, it's not worth their trouble. They let him go. Okay, so like, oh, you're right. Gath is, Achish is probably pissed that they wasted his time. So they just let him go, and David's life is preserved. Okay, at this point in time. Now, there's 2 psalms that David wrote in response to this little portion, okay, that we just read. I'll read only one of them. Psalms 34 is one of them, and then Psalms 56 is the other one. So let me read Psalms 56. And if I can get there. Oh, you got there, Becky. Nice job. You're faster than me. All right, Psalms 56. So I'm just going to read this. And remember, I won't make too many comments, but what's nice about these Psalms is that we really get insight into what's going on in the mind and the heart of David. Okay, and what we really are going to see in these Psalms that I'm going to read is a man who has entrusted his life to the Lord. He doesn't always understand what the Lord is doing. He doesn't always understand, but he's very honest with the Lord. He has this relationship with him, and he puts his life in his hands. Okay, so let's read this. So it says this, a miktam of David, when the Philistines seized him in Gath, right? So that's the very first part of Psalms 56, okay? And so it describes the circumstance that we're just looking at. And here's what David wrote. Be gracious to me, O God, for man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who fight proudly against me. You can imagine what's going on in David's mind. I'm in Israel, Saul and his armies are pursuing me. I go across the border, I get captured here, okay, and I get brought before the king of Gath, and now those are my enemies, okay, so there's so many against me. Verse 3, when I'm afraid, right, so he feared, I will put my trust in thee. Right? Remember, this is the individual who slew the giant, okay, but he's afraid. Verse 4, in God whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere man do to me? All day long they distort my words. All their thoughts are evil against me, all their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited to take my life. Because of wickedness, cast them forth in anger, put down the peoples, O God. Thou hast taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? Right? So he's making this great expression of, you see all of my suffering, you see all of my pain, you see all my tears, and I'm putting my trust in you, right? Despite the enormity of numbers that are against me and that are seeking my life, I'm going to put my trust in you. And he's really solidifying his mind and saying, just like he thought in terms of Goliath, he's solidifying his mind on the truth. If God's for me, no one can be against me. If God desires me to be preserved in this moment, there is nothing that they can do against me. Okay? Right? So that's essentially what he is saying. Verse 9, then my enemies, wait, did I read verse 8? Thou hast taken account of my wanderings, put my tears in thy bottle. Yes, I did read that. Are they not in thy book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose words I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I have put my trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Thy vows are binding upon me, O God. I will render thank offering to thee, for thou hast delivered my soul from death, indeed my feet from stumbling, so that I may walk before God in the light of the living. Okay, and you have to wonder, when he wrote this, did he write part of it? Okay, and then he came back, right, and then he wrote another part of it, and then he came back, right. So let's say he gets captured and he writes this thing down, right, when he's thrown into some constraints, and he writes part of it down, like, they're against me, all these things, and then he comes back, and eventually at the end of it he gets to verse 13, and he's saying, I've been set free, right, and that's when because he's seen the Lord act on his behalf. All right. So that's what's going on, at least partially in the mind of David. You can read Psalms 34 on your own. Okay. The beginning of Psalms 34 actually says, written by David when he feigned madness before the king of Gath. Okay. So anyway. All right. So the king. So David definitely puts his trust in God. Okay. Now let's flip over here. Okay. So he gets away from first of all Saul, and then Doeg, and then the king of Gath and the Philistines, and that brings us to verse 1 of chapter 22, and it says this: So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. Now, notice he goes to this cave, okay, and all of these people start to gather around him, okay. Certainly his family gathers around him. His family are now just as much fugitives as he is, right? There's no way that Saul is not seeking their lives as well, right? He's going to put every type of pressure that he can upon David, potentially capturing his family, threatening his family to bring David out, right, so that he can kill David, right? So they're in danger. But it says this, notice that it says this in verse 2, it says, and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Now, we have seen Saul's erratic, insane behavior, okay, as a king, okay. You can imagine what kind of leadership he was giving and how the people suffered under his rule, okay. And that's essentially what's being described here, that there were those who were essentially they were discontented, they were in debt, right? They were discouraged. The direction that their nation was going was not a good direction, and Saul was, partly, if not wholly, to blame for that. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things to think about here, but let me go ahead and read this. This is one of the commentaries I read. Really, I thought did a good job describing this, essentially the morale of the nation of Israel at this point in time. Okay, it says this: the situation of the country, which was becoming more and more melancholy under Saul, drove men to seek a leader from whom they might hope for better things for the future. David did not send away these refugees, many of them distinguished and prominent Israelites, but organized them into a military force. He foresaw that while commanding such a company as this, he might, without injuring his king and former benefactor, be of the very greatest use to the people and protect the southern frontiers of the kingdom, sadly exposed in these latter years of King Saul, from the plundering incursions of the neighboring nomadic tribes. The state of things, with a few interruptions, really came to pass, and David won great repute and popularity among the protected districts during these years when he was a wandering and an outlaw, and a popularity which in after years stood him in a good stead. Right, so in other words, what's going on is that because of Saul's obsession with killing David, he has essentially forsaken the protection of the southern border in particular, and that southern border has become susceptible to then incursions from surrounding tribes, including the Philistines. And I mean, Saul has forsaken that as his duty. Okay. David then has these people start to accumulate around him. He then makes a military force, and as we find out as we go through these upcoming chapters, in his outlaw refugee status, while he is trying to escape from Saul, he is also doing a great service to the people in the southern border. He is actually protecting the lands with this military force that he has, essentially SEAL Team 6, okay, from the incursions of the surrounding nations, okay, or surrounding really tribes, okay, at this point in time, okay. Now, the cave. Let's think about a little bit about the cave, Adullam. Okay, there is this valley. I have to read just a second. This is in my notes too. I didn't memorize this, but where is it? This cave. So the valley of Elah, which is what's being described, is in the southern part of Israel, and it really stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Dead Sea. Okay, and within that, even to this day, there are these crevices that have these deep, deep caves in them, expansive caves within them. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of Petra, okay, but Petra is on the other side of the Dead Sea. It's in the Jordan, but that kind of thing is what you'd see. Petra is essentially a dwelling in a cave that they've. I don't even know. Do you know what ancient people carved out Petra?
No.
Nope. Okay. But anyway, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you know what I'm talking about? They actually show a picture of Petra in that. Okay, and that's just a portion of the Petra, but it's essentially these cave dwellings, enormous cave dwellings. So we don't know exactly where the cave of Adullam is. Adullam means refuge, okay, but that's where David is, okay, at this point in time, okay? And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, actually, one more thing here. Before I get to verse 3, let's read another Psalms because it describes this time. So turn to Psalms, I think it's 104. Nope, 142.
The Nabateans, Arab
Nabateans. Okay, there we go. Bedouins. Go stop it.
No.
Okay. All right, so let's look at Psalms 142 before we go on. It says this, a maskil of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. Okay, so this is, we're going to get to see, again, another insight into what's going on in David's mind as we're walking through these things. Okay, so David says, I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare my troubles before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, thou didst know my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. So this is a prayer, right? Right, you get really down to the heart of what David is suffering here. He's in this cave, which Adullam means refuge, and he in the cave says, I have made you my refuge, right? And he's saying, they surround me, right? My life, my very life is in danger. I'm crying out to you, save me. Verse 7, bring my soul out of prison so that I may give thanks to thy name. The righteous will surround me, for thou wilt deal bountifully with me. Okay, so that's a prayer, right? I mean, it's pretty raw, and it's saying I'm in it. I'm in a rough circumstance. Okay, and it's these Psalms, when you think about it, when life's troubles comes against us, a lot of people will turn to the book of Psalms and take comfort in prayers like this and make them their own prayers. Okay, and so we see here David, what's really, really remarkable about David is that he turns to the Lord continuously, time and again. He constantly turns his heart to the Lord when he's in trouble. Okay, and he relied deeply and heavily upon his relationship with the Lord. Okay, and he's called a man after God's own heart. Now, he makes terrible, terrible mistakes in his life. And if we were to go on and study 2 Samuel, we'd read about those that have massive consequences for really his whole life. Okay, but at the same time, even in those times, after he recognizes those mistakes, he turns to the Lord and he repents of them. So a fairly remarkable man that we're reading about here. Okay,
and I think that ties into the point that you were making when you were reading out of Matthew, right? And you were expounding on what the gospel really is versus the law.
Right.
And that's what David demonstrates so well, is he relies so heavily on God covering and dealing with his sin instead of him trying to do right and be right in order for his sin. And that's where I think the moniker of a man after God's own heart is really the thing. Because like in Galatians, Paul says that if you add anything to that gospel, that thing that through Christ, God's grace has gifted you this. If you add anything to that, you become accursed or anathema, right? And David just demonstrates that. He doesn't demonstrate sinlessness. He demonstrates reliance on the one that can deal with his sin.
Right.
And that's why he's given that moniker.
And that relationship, he knows that about his God.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that his God is merciful, and he knows that his God is loving, and he knows that his God is gracious, and that's exactly what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
Like, if you would have known this about me, then you wouldn't be oppressing the innocent, right? And so the Pharisees would have venerated David, but they didn't have nearly the relationship and the understanding of David's God that David did.
Yeah.
So anyway, so David, an interesting individual. Now, verse 3. So he's starting to collect these 400 men. Yes, protect us from people already in the house. Good job. Gosh. So he's got these 400 men. We'll read about these men as we go on. They become some of David's most trusted military commanders as we move forward. Okay, and they are in many ways men of renown. And you can hear if you get into 2 Samuel. You can read about the feats that these men accomplish. Okay, they're really, really remarkable men. I said SEAL Team 6, and that was actually not a joke. These guys are warriors. But verse 3 here, and David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab. So this is again not Israel. Moab is not Israel. It's one of the southern bordering territories. But he says to this king, he says, "Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me." Now, interesting point here. His dad, Jesse, is the grandson of Ruth, who was a Moabitess. So she was from Moab. So there's already a family connection there. So this is not a stretch for David to go to Moab and say, "Hey, will you take care of really someone with Moab blood in them?" Okay, right. So then, verse 4. Then he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So he provides for his family. His mom and his dad, potentially his brothers. What in the world?
It's just my
phone. Oh, okay. And potentially his brothers by taking them to Moab. Okay. Now, verse 5, and the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. So Gad is an interesting individual. There are two prophets that are really prominent in David's life. Gad is one of them that we hear about here. The other one is Nathan. They both will remain with David for really his entire life. Obviously Gad appearing here very early on in the life of David. He actually outlives David. And in, I think it's 1 Chronicles 29, verse 29, Gad is described as being a compiler of some of the history of David's reign. So it's very possible that even some of what we're reading now came from Gad and his recording of these events. I think it's not a stretch to think that Gad met David or was introduced to David by Samuel in the school of the prophets, right? So Samuel had anointed David and had taken care of David, had trained David, had taught David a great deal. Gad was I think without a doubt one of Samuel's pupils as well, and the two of them probably just hit it off, and they remained friends for really the entirety of their lives. But in any case, apparently there was some danger here for David to remain in this stronghold, Adullam, okay, and he was told to go to the land of Judah, okay. Now, verse 6, then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. So you know where that tree is, so just remember where that tree is, okay? So obviously the writer expects the reader to know where this tree was. Maybe he didn't foresee that people in the 21st century would be reading this, but anyway, there's Saul by the tree in Gibeah with his spear that he's tried to kill both Jonathan and David with. That spear is like his friend, man. I mean, he's insane with that spear. But anyway, so there he is. And Saul said to his servant who stood around, or his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?" Now, notice that there's nepotism going on here. Saul is a Benjamite, and he's got all his servants, and they're all Benjamites. And he says, "Do you really think that David's going to take care of you the way I'm taking care of you? Right? I've given you all this stuff." Right? He's pissed. He's pissed at his servants, right? Because he wants David's head on a platter, and he can't get it, and so he turns his wrath to these people, and he says, if David comes to rule, you guys are the first that's going to have problems, right? You need to remain loyal to me because I'm taking care of you. I'm paying you well, okay? At the expense of the southern borders and at the expense of the rest of the nation of Israel, right? I mean, people are suffering under Saul because of his nepotism, okay? All right, now, verse 8, "For all of you have conspired against me," Saul speaking to these men, "so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son Jonathan makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is this day." Don't we feel so bad for Saul? I mean, I just feel so bad for Saul, right? No one tells me anything, and none of you feel sorry for me.
Such a molehead.
Right? Okay, well, whatever. Okay, now, here, enter back Doeg, right? So then Doeg, the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, "Actually, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him." Right? So he, being Ahimelech, inquired of the Lord, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Okay, so Doeg says, "Yeah, I saw him, and this is what Ahimelech did." Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. Okay, and Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub," and he answered, "Here I am, Lord." Right, so he's brought this priest, who we read about in the last chapter, who gave the bread to David, who gave the sword to David, okay? He's brought this priest to him because Doeg says, "Yeah, I saw him do this." Okay. Now remember, Saul is not in a good state of mind. He's got conspiracies on his mind. Okay, this is a conspiracy theory. Ahimelech is against him. Okay. Now remember, if you remember, this is going back to last week. David lied to Ahimelech. He said, "I'm on a king's mission, and it's such an urgent mission that I can't even tell you what it is. It's super spy stuff. I can't tell you." Right? That was the understanding of Ahimelech. Okay, he didn't have any understanding of the essentially internal war that was going on between Saul and David. Okay, and so verse 13, Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise up against me by laying in ambush as it is this day?" Now, I don't know where Saul gets the idea that he's laying an ambush against him, but that's not David's circumstance right now, right? We're following David's line of thought, and he is being ambushed on all sides. He's not lying in ambush for Saul, but that's what's going on in Saul's mind, right? Anyway, verse 14, "Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is a captain over your guard and is honored in your house?" In other words, may I remind you that as far as I know, David is your faithful servant. He plays a harp even though you try and kill him with a spear for you, right? He is by the way, your son-in-law. He's married to your daughter, and he's honored in your household. He's always at your feast and all these things. This is what I know of David, right? I have no idea what you're talking about, in other words. Verse 15 says, did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Now, according to scholars, this is a really hard verse to translate, and so yours might say something a little bit different than what I've got. But it says, far be it from me, do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the households of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. Okay. Verse 15, the very beginning of it, says, did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Seems to indicate that maybe what Ahimelech is saying is I've been doing this with David for a long time at your command, right? I don't know anything of what you're talking about. I was just operating as I have been operating for a long time, right? It doesn't say that he goes on to tell him that David just told me he was on an urgent mission, but, he probably says that at some point in time, okay? But he says, I don't know anything about what you're talking about, okay? But the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. And the king said to the guards who were attending him, turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also was with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me. But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. So he's gone way off the wagon, right? I mean, he is now going to, and he's given an order to his guards to slaughter the priests, okay, and all their family. Saul is not in a good state. Now, but his servants are in a better state, right? The guards say, I don't know if I can carry out that command. That's a command of insanity. I'm not going to do that, okay? But, and we don't know what their end is, okay? It doesn't tell us. I'm sure it wasn't good. But verse 18 says this, then the king said to Doeg, you turn around and attack the priest. Now, and Doeg, the Edomite, turned around and attacked the priest, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. So this was, Doeg recognized, this is my chance to make the king happy. This is gonna be great, right? Now, tradition, meaning extra biblical sources, say that Doeg became the king's armor bearer, which was essentially as close to the king as you can get. Okay, so a really high position. It was probably with Saul until his last day. Okay, we don't know if that's exactly true, but that seems likely. Okay, now he's probably not operating alone. He's probably operating, to kill 85 people, right? It's not like they all just sat there and said, okay, yeah, just kill me next. Okay, so he probably has his own servants that he's ordering around. But verse 19, and he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. Okay, so Saul essentially carries out what he was unwilling to carry out in 1 Samuel 15 with at the command of the Lord, then the Amalekites. The Amalekites were told to be wiped out. Saul said, well, I think I'll keep some things for myself. I'm not sure I want to kill their king. But when it comes to his own will, he has no problem killing everyone in Nob. Okay, and Doeg is the one that does this. Okay, now, verse 20. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Now, Abiathar will become the priest and will remain the priest throughout the remainder of David's life, all the way up until Solomon's reign. Okay. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. Okay. In other words, David harkens back to that time he saw Doeg in the last chapter, right, with Ahimelech, and said, this is trouble, and tried to leave as soon as possible. But it wasn't soon enough, as it turns out. Okay, now, let's go ahead and look at one more psalm here, okay, and we'll kind of sum up the rest of the night. And this is Psalms 52. because this is ascribed, this psalm is ascribed to the events that we just read. In particular, Abiathar bringing news to David that Saul has killed all these priests, okay, and their families, okay? So when you look at this, it says, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech, okay? Right, so verse 1, this is what David is going on in his mind and his heart. He says, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The loving kindness of God endures all day long. Your tongue devises destruction. Like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God, right? So he describes essentially, these are his thoughts. This is a description of Saul. This is a description of Doeg, right? Now, verse 5. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. And the righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desire. Right? So in other words, he then describes in those 3 verses what will be the end of those evil men, right? And that is that God will take his vengeance out on him. Okay, but then he goes to himself. But he says, as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. I will give thee thanks forever, because thou hast done it. And I will wait on thy name, for it is good in the presence of thy godly ones. Okay, and so that's David. That's David's mantra. Okay, especially as a young man, I'm going to trust in the Lord, and because he trusts in the Lord, he ascribes all of the successes of his life to his God. Okay, he describes and he ascribes his safety to his God. When he escapes, he ascribes that to God because he has put his trust in him. Okay, and I think that, just as I was thinking about this and reading these Psalms tonight, right before we got together, I thought I would share this with you. This is not written by David, but I wanted to share with you Psalms 118, verse 8, because I think it really paints a really good picture of really what David is practicing, okay, and what we need to help ourselves, or what we ourselves need to practice. Now, what's interesting about Psalms 118:8, and I didn't do this, okay, someone did, but if you were to take, okay, all the letters, I think it's in the King James Version of the Bible, okay, and you were to number them up and find the exact halfway point. This is from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, and find the exact halfway point. The very middle of that King James Bible is Psalms 118, verse 8, and it says this: it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. Okay, and that's exactly what David is illustrating, that he took refuge in the Lord and didn't trust in men. And I just find it interesting that the very central portion of the Bible says that it's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man, okay, or to put your confidence in men. It's so instructive to us, and I think David has depicted that time and time again. And as we'll continue to read, David's just going to be running for his life for the next 10 years as we read through this. So, okay. So that's it. We're done with chapter 22. We'll probably go through chapter 23. I don't know, maybe 24 next week. Okay. Moving kind of fast through this. We only have 31 chapters in all of the book of 1 Samuel, meaning that if we keep it moving at this pace, we'll probably end 1 Samuel March to maybe April, leaving us maybe a little bit of time to maybe dip into the New Testament. Maybe we'll pick a real small book or something like that to go through and up through May. So I don't know exactly what we'll do, but we'll see where we land. So, okay. All right, so let's go ahead and pray, though. Well, Lord Jesus, we're just grateful for these stories. We're grateful for the fact that you put this in black and white for us, that someone before us translated them into a language that we can read. And then that your Holy Spirit would translate it into the language of our heart and in our minds. And I pray that you would do that. I pray that as we consider those Psalms and as we consider the life of David, that your Spirit would apply those things to our own lives, and that we would, as the central the central verse of your Bible says, that we would put our trust in you, and that we would take our refuge in you, and not put our confidence in men. Lord. So discipline us to that effect. In your name, amen. All right.